it's impossible to talk about diplomacy in our generations without, my generation certainly, without talking about Richard Holbrooke. He was just an extraordinary force of nature itself, and it can be an extremely annoying one too, certainly for reporters. He always liked to say that he tried to get a job at the New York Times when he was young, and he didn't get one, something he reminded me of constantly. He would stop you on the tarmac if you wrote about him, anything, even if it wasn't an article about him, but one in which he was mentioned. And he would have it annotated, it would be underlined, he would go through every point by point by point. Almost Talmudic in his analysis of everything, but he was an extraordinary, extraordinary force to change things. I personally went on a self-imposed Holbrooke moratorium for a while because I was so annoyed by his spin. I decided that I was just not going to talk to him anymore. There were a lot of people who were players out there who were going to tell me the truth, and I went for several months without talking to him. And I recall that I had a lunch, a bureau chief from another magazine actually took me out to lunch. He was trying to recruit me, and he was asking me who my sources were. Of course, I wasn't going to give him everything, but I gave him a few names and people I liked to talk to in DC. And he said, "You didn't mention Holbrooke." And I said, no, I'm on a self-imposed Holbrooke moratorium. And I could feel the temperature in the room go down. He couldn't understand how anyone could not want to talk to Richard Holbrooke, and he was right. He was right. I went back to talk to him after that. He was a pretty extraordinary guy. Holbrooke had been the U.S. ambassador in Germany and not involved in it at all, and then was brought back, as I recall, as the Assistant Secretary of State for Europe. And, as I recall, he was sort of dragged into it in the meeting. It's not the way he describes it in his book. But he was a real believer in the force of personality and his ability to negotiate things. And he was, almost lost his life on, Mount Egmont, when he was driving along, and we lost several U.S. diplomats on that road. Very moved by that. It's the opening scene of his book. And he, had spent a lot of time talking to Milosevic and to Izetbegovic, the head of the Bosnian Muslims, and to Tudjman in Croatia. And he really did believe that with a mixture of sanctions and a little bit of military pressure that it was going to get there. And he finally did get to them to the point, and what he did was, it was pretty extraordinary. He brought them all to a U.S. Air Force base in Dayton and locked them down, where we're talking sensory deprivation here, and didn't let them out until they agreed. And the terms which he brought them there in the first place, and all of their economies were suffering, and they were under an enormous amount of pressure, their terms were, you are going to come and you're not going to leave until we have a deal. And then he just pushed them and pushed them and pushed them and pushed them. And, I think that it was such an extraordinary success, and you can look at it afterwards and you can say, Croatia turned out pretty well, and Serbia's eventually turned out pretty well. Bosnia, the constitution that was written that is, based on, much like Lebanon is based on, if you're, Bosnia and Serbia get this number of positions in the legislature or in the Supreme Court, it's pretty dysfunctional, but they're not killing each other, so I think it's a great success. And I think when he took over in Afghanistan under Obama, I think that he thought the force of his personality could do that as well. And he never had the opportunity to do it, and it didn't work. But I think he always thought he could replicate that.